Well, good morning. And thank you so much for joining us today and investing the time to participate in this panel. The panel conversation, of course, is a conversation regarding academic integrity and file sharing sites. And today we're going to learn from this incredible panel of experts to engage in a solution-oriented dialogue regarding the rising increased use of file sharing sites, a challenge that has been exacerbated by the transition to working in a virtual space during the last year or so. But before we begin our conversation, I would like to introduce our amazing panel, Sarah Eaton, Kelly Ahuna, and John Paul Foxe. And if I could just ask you each to take a moment to introduce yourselves before we begin the conversation, please. Sarah, we'll begin with you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you this morning. I'm joining you from Treaty 7 territory. My city is Calgary, and I'm at the University of Calgary.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome. And Kelly, may I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for having me. I'm a little scared when you say the word expert. I think the only thing that makes me an expert is how much experience I've had dealing with these file sharing sites. But I'm happy to have this conversation today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for your contributions. And of course, last but not least, John Paul.
Hi, morning, everyone. Kelly, I had the exact same reaction with Holly when you said incredible panel of experts. I was like, who's she talking? Am I on that panel? Anyway, I'm John Paul Foxe. I'm the director of the Academic Integrity Office at Ryerson University in Toronto. And it is very, very nice to see you all and hear you all today. Thank you so much, Amy, and you, Holly, and everyone at Seneca for organizing today's session. It's been wonderful so far.
Well, thank you. And I'm confident to hear from your brilliance. I know, no pressure. So audience, just so we're aware, again, feel free to share your questions in the chat. My colleague will be monitoring the chat. But first, to kick things off, I do have a question that I'd love each member of our panel to begin with. And then again, it'll be a more fluid conversation, so feel free to build off of each other. And of course, as I mentioned, I will pause at times to check in with the audience as well. So to begin, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think that we can do to make students aware of the pitfalls regarding using sites of this nature? And I'll defer to the panelists. Feel free to just begin and raise your hand. Go ahead, Sarah. Let's begin with you.
Yeah, I love that we're starting this question with the focus on students rather than policy or sanctions or anything like that. And I think there's so much we can do. In fact, this was a topic that we discussed at yesterday, informal community of practice around academic integrity called Integrity Hour, and the need to involve students more, both whether it was in classes or through having programs such as Amanda McKenzie talked about at the University of Waterloo, through the library, having student ambassadors, but the idea of engaging students as active members rather than us merely transmitting information to them about what not to do, but then rather engaging them as active members of their own learning communities, our learning institutions, to drive some of the work forward. And I don't think we yesterday in our conversation came up with specific solutions, but we recognized a common need to continue to have students actively leading some of the work.
Okay, so more of a collaboration than a policy-oriented process. Excellent, thank you. Sarah, I saw your hand. Would you like to continue?
Yeah, so I think I forgot to say, because I was so overwhelmed by expert, that I'm from the University of Buffalo, which is part of the State University of New York system. So I'm on the other side of the border, and I can't visit my friends in Canada now, sadly. But one thing I think about this student-centered part of this question is that if we step back and look at these file sharing sites from the student perspective, I feel like there are two parts. There are students who are deliberately trying to do something dishonest. And then there are students who I think genuinely think they are doing the right thing by seeking help to teach themselves when they're stuck. And I think with those sort of the education about these sites needs to come from those two different perspectives. And the point that I'm always trying to make with students is, you know, it is good to help yourself. It is good to seek answers when you need answers, but you can never look at the solution to a problem upon which you are going to be scored. And helping students understand that the responsibility of the faculty member is to assess at the end of the day what the students have learned or know, as we did in our morning talk. And that's, if really what the instructor is assessing is what the people who work for a sharing site know, the value of that assessment is really decreased. And I think students, you know, from their point of view as a student are not thinking globally like that. So I think the more conversation we can have around the boundaries, the better.
Bear with me. Thank you so much for that. And I'm hearing from you also that the balance of assessments, the design with intention, and that demonstration of knowledge. That's excellent. Thank you. And John Paul, over to you.
Thanks. And of course, I agree very much with what Sarah and Kelly have already said. And I think, you know, there are many different approaches to this. And I just want to share one particular example at Ryerson. So a few years ago, before the move to remote teaching, this came up, and it was driven actually by our faculty association at Ryerson. So what was happening was that faculty members were becoming aware that their course materials were being posted on these file sharing sites, and they were very unhappy about it. And they said, well, what is the university, capital U University as a whole, going to do about this? So we got quite a few people in a room and had lots and lots of conversations. Part of the conversation was, whose responsibility is this? So at Ryerson, we try as best we can to take an educational approach, and recognizing what Kelly has said, a lot of students were sharing and continue to share on these websites, thinking that they're helping each other out. They're helping themselves, and that they're helping their colleagues by sharing their notes, by sharing their professor slides, all these sorts of things. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to make students aware of the possible ramifications, the consequences of doing this. So we created a webpage in collaboration with our librarian, and we posted a link right on our learning management site. So every time a student logs in to see their courses, we use D2L as our LMS, our learning management site. There's a link, and I will read it to you. I pulled it up just before we came on here. And the link says, students, are you thinking about sharing course materials online? And then there's a link that students can click to, and it says the academic misconduct implications of posting your professor's class material online. And then that will take them to a library page specifically for students. I'll post the link to that library page in the chat here if people want to have a look at it. So the idea with this was, when students logged in, saw their, to access their courses through the LMS, that resource was there for them, to take them through it, to try and help educate them as to why it may not be the best idea. So this was one approach that we took, one of many.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that link in the chat. And I can see in the chat from the audience that there is support with regards to, you know, understanding a student's motivation and how we can provide the support. So actually building off of your example and remaining focused on a student-based conversation, you know, how do your institutional policies address the students when they do share these materials on the sites, and how can we again help navigate those challenges? And this is where I'll open it. Sure, go ahead, Kelly.
Well, I feel like this has been an issue for us because we had been sort of addressing this. We have a violation in our policy called aiding in academic dishonesty, when students help each other cheat. So we've had a few cases where students have posted materials online and the instructor has wanted us to pursue it through that avenue, but it doesn't always seem to fit the offense. So actually, I just was on a small committee that we put together. In the fall, we're rolling out a new policy called improper distribution of course materials. And I think what drove this particular policy is we kept having these conversations around, what should the penalty be? What should the sanction be if a student posts things? What do we want them, you know, what should happen? And so what we've come up with is a kind of remediation experience where they're going to do an online module that our libraries are building for us around intellectual property and why intellectual property is important and why they should respect it and uphold it. So we're actually rolling out a whole new, it's obviously related to our academic integrity policy, but it's going to be a separate something called improper distribution of course materials.
Okay, thank you for that. And go ahead, John Paul.
So just adding to what Kelly has said, there's two pieces of our policy at Ryerson that can apply, and I stress the word can. So we have contributing to academic misconduct, which I would imagine is quite similar to what Kelly said, aiding in academic misconduct. And then we have improper sharing of course materials. And this is around the copyright piece, and this is around sharing your faculty members or your professors' materials. But the issue is at Ryerson that faculty members are the first level decision makers, and it is for them to interpret policy. And different faculty members will interpret policy in different ways, and they will have different expectations within their own courses. And this is where it sometimes leads to trouble for students. And I'll give you an example. One faculty member will be very, very clear, and they will say, you are not to share my course slides. They have a notice of the course outline. They state it at the beginning of class. They have a notice in the slides. It's crystal clear that they don't want students to do that. Another faculty member will say, share, post them, give them to whoever wants. I have no problem. And in fact, I encourage you to do that. Another faculty member says nothing about it. So the question then is, what is the student supposed to do? Now, you can argue that the student should err on the side of caution. They maybe shouldn't post. They should go and they should ask beforehand. You know, these are all good questions that maybe we would ask, but not all students are going to ask that. So while it is in our policy, I guess I'm raising an issue with it as well, right? So we need to make sure that we're communicating our expectations very, very clearly to our students.
Yeah, John Paul, we decided to make our policy an opt-in policy for faculty. So if they don't want their materials distributed, they have to put this in their syllabus now, and then students are held accountable to it. But if it's not in their syllabus, then we as the university won't charge the student.
And Sarah, I saw your hand as well. Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah, and I'll just plus what Kelly and John Paul have said. And I think what is coming to the surface here is not only that students have responsibilities, but the institution has responsibilities at the administration level through policy, and instructors have responsibility. And I think on our campus, one of the conversations that we're trying to drive forward is what is the instructor responsibility around this, and that it is not enough for instructors to have a statement in their course outline. And I often tell my colleagues, this does not absolve you of your responsibility to talk about academic integrity in your classes and to set your expectations clearly. We had a case, and I'm sure you've all had similar cases, where an instructor said to a student, yeah, you have an open book exam, use whatever you want, and didn't realize that when they said that the students thought it was okay to use a commercial file sharing site. And the instructor said, well, I didn't mean that. I meant the textbook. And so the instructors themselves, I think, also require some education around what these sites are. We still have many, many faculty members on our campus that don't know about this, and that may sound surprising to us because we live and breathe it every day. But I've had an instructor just last week and said, have you heard of a company that might rhyme with egg? And I said, why, as a matter of fact, I have. What are you wanting to know about it? So every week still we're having new faculty members, not new faculty members, but people sort of discovering for the first time. And it's like, oh, it's a refresh on the indignance and the anger and all of the stuff that goes along with that. So even though we're really infused with this conversation, there's still many people that it's the first time they're having a conversation.
And I can see from the reaction of our panelists that I think everyone is definitely in agreement with that point. So to summarize, I'm hearing a theme of consistency across programs and perhaps even as far as across schools or faculty, and also that demonstration. So not to assume that the language that we are including or generally referencing, let's say in a brief slide, is going to be interpreted as we intend. Okay, excellent. Now, with that, actually, that brings me to my next point regarding then, how can an institution itself support the removal of intellectual property from these file sharing sites? And to your point, Sarah, that frustrating situation, how can they help that faculty member navigate that particular situation, but also then avoid it, hopefully, in the future? Go ahead, John Paul.
Sure. So, Sarah, that you just made me laugh there with your comment. We regularly get, have you heard of Chug? And we say, we know what you're talking about. And then we try and help them as best we possibly can. So when we created this resource for students on why not post your course materials, we created a similar one for faculty saying, what do you do if you find your course materials have been posted online? So again, The driver in this at the time was our faculty association, our faculty union, saying you need to help us with this. So we created a list of, or not a list, a set of resources for faculty, and here I'll share the link for that as well. And in one of those resources, we included a template for a takedown request that faculty can send to these websites. So in our experience, the various file sharing websites won't respond to university-wide requests. That is the experience we have had, saying take down these materials. And their rationale and their response has been, you are not the copyright holder. However, when the individual faculty member sends the request, they will do it because they are the copyright holder. That's the experience we've had. So we've tried to give faculty the tools to make it as easy as possible for them. So while this at the time was very much reactive because it was the union bringing this forward, we've included in that as well, what can you do to try and prevent this from happening? And I think, that is equally, if not more important. So faculty are, number one, aware of this. And then exactly as Kelly and Sarah have said, can post it in the course outline, but can do quite a bit more than that as well, right? So it comes back to properly informing students.
Excellent point. Thank you. I'll just pause if anyone else wishes to share their thoughts. Go ahead, Kelly, and then Sarah.
I would just add to that, we have the same experience, John Paul, about property, intellectual property ownership and who will take down. Now, the company that rhymes with egg is cooperative with us when I, as the director of the Office of Academic Integrity, seek a takedown and information on it. But, these sites are proliferating by the day. I wrote to one on Monday called Just Answer, where I found out that students in our computer science courses were posting how to write code, and a computer science expert will answer it. So I knew they wouldn't help me, but I still submitted a question saying, I'm the director of the Office of Academic Integrity. It's come to my attention. Students have been using your site, to get answers in a dishonest way. How can I get this information? And they wrote back and said, we don't help you, our privacy laws, et cetera, et cetera. And so I feel like in some ways it's good when our students use Chegg because at least that site cooperates with us somewhat. And there are other sites that don't cooperate with us at all. So I do feel as institutions, we have a responsibility to keep asking to apply pressure to these sites so they don't think we don't care or that this is something that's not going to be addressed. So I write to all of them whenever someone sends me something.
Thank you. I think there's irony in that, isn't it? That we're discussing intellectual property and protection of ideas and their responses. Well, our privacy rules protect us from protecting you. Okay, excellent point. Thank you. Over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, this is a fascinating conversation. And I think one of the key points for others on the call today is to understand who owns the intellectual property that's associated with the courses. So it sounds like at Ryerson, it's the property of the individual academic staff member. The same is largely true at the University of Calgary. I think at some other schools, it's the institution who owns it. So knowing who owns it, I think is important. Love those resources that you've developed. And I love that your union has gotten in on some of this. And I think our union, I can't speak for the union, but in informal conversations, they've expressed some concerns about the increase in academic workload that comes with things like, why should academic staff members have to send these individual requests to these companies? And a general increase in workload, certainly during COVID-19. So it would be interesting to examine this from an academic labor point of view. And I will say we've had conversations on our campus as well about should individuals have an account with some of these companies in order to find materials to use perhaps in a misconduct case. My response to that has often been, well, that's like paying the guy on the street corner to find out if what's in the pills he's selling are actually drugs. Like we don't need to contribute to the financial betterment of these corporate institutions. But at the same time, in some ways, we don't have any other way to find out what is actually on the site. So it's a real conundrum. And a conversation we have started at our university, which is still very much in the early stages, is around the need for safe sharing sites on our campuses. And the analogy I use is like a supervised consumption site for drugs. If students are going to behave in this way anyway, how do we make it safe for them to do so? And I think one of the ways we can do that is to have the sharing happen either in our own LMSs or within our own institutional sharing spaces that are approved, so that they don't feel the need to go to outside companies. And it's a big conversation because we need to have our teaching and learning center involved. We need to have our IT folks involved. We need to have our vice provost student experience involved. When we framed it as we need safe sharing sites to protect our students, then that was a palatable conversation. And I think that we'll be able to action it over the next year or two, but it won't be a quick solution. And I think another important piece of this is that whether you have an academic integrity office or you have in particular individuals doing this work, we want to be able to support, but we can't rescue either, whether that's students or faculty. And so when I have faculty members come to me and say, do something, I'm like, what would you like me to do? Because I can't take down a company. None of us as individuals can take down a company. So I think also articulating our expectations about what we can do as individuals within our respective units and what we can't do and what we can do as a larger institution and a community. So those are sort of different levels of conversations. But when a faculty member comes to me angry or indignant, I try and find a respectful way to say, I can't solve your problem, but we can work on it together.
Go ahead, Kelly.
Sarah, I think that's such a fascinating approach, because one of the things that I feel in my conversations with students is very often when they go to these sites, they go, the assignments due at midnight, it's 11:45, they can't get a TA, they can't get, so that's their time management issue, and they need to start earlier so they can access authorized resources. But I think that that's also part of the conversation about the timing of when students are working and when they really need help, and if they could get it from a legitimate place that we've set up, that's a whole new way. I haven't thought of that before, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Again, I'm hearing a theme of sort of strategic planning and integrating multiple voices in the conversation to continue to be solution oriented. I'm also hearing the theme of sort of removing that emotional piece that is, although understandable, perhaps not productive in these challenging situations. Thank you for your thoughts. I'd like to take a moment to pause and pass it over to Catherine. I believe we do have some comments and questions she'd like to share from the chat. So over to you.
Yes, thank you, Holly. Definitely some comments, and I don't want to interrupt the thread of what Sarah raised, because that is quite fascinating. But we've heard from Conestoga that similar to some of what you've said, at Conestoga College, their academic integrity office will scan and request removal of documents on behalf of faculty members. And that could be interesting to help avoid the mass accounts being created and pockets being lined that we don't particularly want to line. And also a statement that was shared earlier, which I think will continue to sort of come up, that relationship between the role of faculty and the role of students and what can be done to support each other. And the comment was, we must also educate our faculty about the aggressive marketing and advertising strategies that these third-party companies deploy. And when we do so and frame it as students as victims or as targeted by these companies, we can actually leverage faculty sympathy and a bit of a protectionist mentality. And maybe that could help open the lines of communication between faculty and students. And I just didn't want to lose that comment, because I think it's a really interesting reminder and also a way to humanize what we're encountering. And so I just wanted to make sure to share that. And another question was shared, and this is from Jenny, and it was, I am going to circle back to what Sarah raised. And so I think you did answer it, but maybe a chance to share it vocally for those that are maybe following the chat. Jenny asked who would manage these safe sharing sites to be sure that they are not using them improperly or breaching copyright, etc.
Okay, so yes, let's begin with you, Sarah. So how can we manage and perhaps even implement and develop these sites?
That's the very question that we're trying to puzzle through right now. And we know that it would have to be, I think, a collaborative effort. So we have on our campus a vice provost of teaching and learning and a vice provost of student experience. And one of the, I think, exciting developments that we have in the past couple of years is we've been able to move the needle on whose responsibility is academic integrity, because it used to only be a policy and procedural, portfolio. And now it's also shifting over to teaching and learning. So we're seeing these hybrid approaches, and we're seeing more of these two vice provosts in meetings around academic integrity. I suspect it would end up being a joint initiative between the Teaching and Learning Center and the Student Success Center, with IT involved and learning technology specialists as well. Like I said, we're in the very, very early stages, but I think there's buy-in for the concept. And now when I hear our Vice Provost of Student Experience saying, well, if students are going to play with fire, we want to teach them how to play with fire safely. I'm like, yes, we do. Thank you for your support. And of course, asking how we'll resource that. We're kind of getting stuck on that piece because we're in Alberta at the moment with the various cutbacks that we have. But nevertheless, I think that it's an urgent enough issue. Because the other way that we're framing it is from an economic point of view, and that's that for all of our associate deans who do the case management of our academic misconduct cases, so we don't have a centralized academic integrity office here for case management, for example, like what does it cost these associate deans in terms of their hours when they are managing 800 plus cases of academic misconduct in a term? And what's the cost of the university in terms of their labor, because they're academics, and so they're also supposed to be doing research. And so when we try and quantify that, and what's the number of cases of appeals that are coming forward, and what is this costing the university, and being able to say, if we could shift that to prevention, as John Paul was talking about, and education, rather than case management and investigation, then would be having a better application of our resources. So that's how we're trying to move that conversation forward.
Excellent point. Thank you. And perhaps I could expand on your point just to the other panelists on how do you navigate case management and those similar situations in your institutions? Go ahead, John Paul.
So as I had mentioned, faculty members are the first level decision makers. So it is at Ryerson, so it is for them to bring the cases forward. However, our office, the Academic Integrity Office, will support them with that. So we have a very specific set of procedures and guidelines that are supposed to be followed when faculty members are investigating the suspicions of misconduct and when they are making their findings as to whether it has happened or not. However, just to touch upon something that Sarah has mentioned, the volume that our faculty members has been dealing with, particularly over the past year or so, has led to some real challenges. We have some incredibly dedicated faculty members at Ryerson, as I'm sure all of you do, who are really, really committed to promoting integrity at the university. And even they are saying, I don't know how much more of this I can do. I don't know how much more, because there are only so many hours in the day. So while we have had our system, and we have our policy, I just wonder, given everything that has happened over the past year, is it time for us to look at our policy and procedures and ask maybe we need to change them? Which I'm sure all of us are asking similar sorts of questions.
Sure. It does seem to be a very fluid process, doesn't it?
Right now, certainly, yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, and Kelly, over to you.
It sounds like our process is very much like John Paul's. It starts with faculty. They have to report. They have to have a consultative resolution meeting, we call it, with the student. But then we have an Office of Academic Integrity to handle the cases, the appeals, and so on that come in. But I did have a really heartfelt conversation with an instructor who is one of those committed instructors John Paul was talking about. And she said, you know, this is so difficult because I want to uphold these values of integrity, but it doesn't count for research. It doesn't count for service. It doesn't count for teaching. And so, you know, I've started sending letters to instructors, sort of thanking them. Anybody who serves on our committees, I send them letters, something to put in their portfolio for tenure, just to show that they're committed to this. I'd like very much to start giving a faculty award to recognize someone who's upholding the values of integrity, just small ways that we can incentivize them not to give up on this. So I think that's really important. And I just want to say, I don't really want to turn the conversation, but the other thing that Catherine mentioned about these sites being savvy in their recruitment of students is really not something to understate, because, CHEG, I think, is the best example of this. They started out as a textbook vendor. You can get discounted textbooks from them. They have legitimate resources. And, in the United States, if you get something called a Sallie Mae loan, which is a particular kind of higher education loan, you get a free semester of CHEG. So that to the student makes CHEG look like a very legitimate, authorized kind of resource. And so then we have to fight this battle of why it's not. So.
Thank you for that. And I think that also returns back to the messaging of being very literal. Students joining from differing educational experiences, for example, may have different expectations they've previously applied to their studies. And now, you're right, they're looking to navigate a new environment. I'd like to pause if that's all right, because I know we do have a few more questions, and pass it back over to Catherine. Thank you, panel.
Thank you, Holly. A question from one of our participants. Are there any consequences at your institutes that are outlined for students who can be identified if they post the materials? She goes on to say, I had a few students a few years back in my class, and after a year or two, I identified that student who posted the materials from my lecture notes. When I approached the student didn't respond, as the student had already graduated and had nothing to do with the institute. So just to circle back the question itself, what are the consequences that might be outlined for those students that you can identify who post materials?
And perhaps I could add to that, Catherine, we can compartmentalize both for current and then perhaps for graduates.
Exactly, that's another layer to it.
Mm-hmm, exactly. So John Paul, let's begin with you and then over to Kelly. Saw your hands.
Sure. So if you have graduated, it is extremely unlikely that the university will take any action. If you are a former student, if a student would have to have done something really egregious for the student for their university to reopen their record. It has happened, I think, twice in the history of the university. So if a student, short answer, if a student has posted some course materials and then they graduate, nothing is going to happen to that student from within the university anyway. If they are still a Ryerson student and the course is long gone, but they're still a student, it does still fall under our academic integrity policy, so action can still be taken. I don't want to get into the weeds too much about how our policy works, but very broadly speaking, we have two categories of misconduct. One is called in-course and one is called not in-course. You know what, I'm going to stop there. I won't go down that road. Anyway, so it is actionable under our academic integrity policy if the student is still a current student.
Okay, thank you. And I can appreciate diving deep into policies. That could probably take the rest of the time. Nope, that's a superb overview. Thank you so much. And Kelly, I'd like to go over to you now.
Sure. Yeah, I concur with John Paul about students who have already graduated. It is very difficult to go back and charge them with something. However, in the new improper distribution of course material policy that's going to roll out for us in fall, this was the conversation, because most of the students who post to, they might put all of their course materials from Biology 101 on Course Hero or something. They often do that the semester after they've had the class. And most of our sanctions are course related, a grade deduction in the course, a 0 on an assignment kind of thing. So it's harder for us to find an appropriate sanction. We actually talked about putting this under our student conduct policy because it's theft and treating it like theft. And that's why we ended up working with libraries to design this remediation module to give students instruction about the value of academic integrity. And that's their penalty to go through this educational experience. If they have a repeat offense, we're still working out what that penalty will be, but that's kind of how we're trying to handle it.
Thank you. Go ahead, John Paul, and then Sarah.
Sorry, Sarah, just very, very briefly, it's the exact same, Kelly, at Ryerson. So when I spoke of the in-course, that would be, the grade associated penalty, and then the not in course or the outside of course. That's where issues like this would be handled, where you can no longer penalize the grade. right? Or maybe it's not associated with the grade. So when that happens, if there's a finding of misconduct, the most likely outcome is that it will go on the student's internal record and it'll be tracked then for purposes of progressive discipline. So if the student engages in misconduct in another time. Sorry, Sarah, please go ahead.
No, that's okay. I think it works quite similarly at our university, but I wanted to point out in our policies and procedures, we made a subtle but important change a couple of years ago, and that's that we've embedded it, that there's no statute of limitations on pursuing cases of academic misconduct. So we've phrased it such that it must be reported by the faculty member after it's discovered, which is different from after when it occurred. And so this means that if students are cheating, you know, they're posting their materials the semester after, and they're still a student and somebody finds it, we can pursue that. And as John Paul mentioned, it might be an annotation on the internal transcript, that kind of thing. But the students would still be subjected to sanctions for that misconduct. And it's not like this idea of once you're done, you're done. Again, we're starting to have conversations. If those students are graduates, that it might still be appropriate to put on the internal transcript. So if those students ever want to come back and apply for graduate school, that those consequences may apply. And so we're a commuter campus, and many of our students do come back for graduate programs later on, so that this is not consequence-free. And we're trying to get that message across. But again, these sort of policy things, then how are we enacting the policy? But this idea of students thinking that there's a statute of limitations on when misconduct can be pursued is a myth we're trying to bust.
Excellent key message to conclude your point, Sarah. So it really sounds like there's sort of a multiple phase approach, the proactive approach to not just educate and inform faculty and students, but also, Kelly, going back to your point of even acknowledging opportunities to reiterate those shared values, to motivate, to uphold these standards. There also seems to be a bit of a blurred line between copyright issues and then a conduct and academic integrity issue that's being addressed. And then, of course, transitioning into, to your point, Sarah, of how things are being managed with regards to hopefully avoiding that consequence piece, but having to recognize when a violation has occurred. With that, then I'd like to actually sort of transition the conversation to look more towards maybe perhaps the future of our practice. Given these file sharing sites are becoming more challenging and obviously sounds like more prevalent, do you feel that that's going to then impact how we instruct, how we assess, and even just our interactions and dynamic with our students in the course content itself? Go ahead, Kelly. I know sometimes that was a bit of a big one, so you needed to digest it a little bit.
The future is hard. I mean, I think many instructors who know about these sites are already trying to change their assessment, move toward authentic assessment. If the pandemic has done anything, it's done that. But we know that students can still get authentic assessments completed for them at these sites. So that doesn't solve all our problems. I really, not to be overly dramatic, but I think the future of our education system sort of hinges on us getting this right. The value of our diplomas, if they don't stand for what they say they stand for, if we graduate an engineering student who can't do engineering because he outsourced all his work, we've got problems. So I don't have the solution, except that we need to keep the conversation going. And that's why I was so excited about Sarah's idea earlier about, maybe we treat it like drugs, I think was the analogy, right? And we give them a legitimate place to do the sharing. But I come back to the generational issues that I face as, a middle-aged person dealing with this generation. Their ideology around sharing is different than my ideology around sharing. And they've grown up, sharing photos and music and pictures and thinking that they can ask their Alexa or their Siri device for answers for anything. And so trying to help them understand why this is not appropriate in an academic setting is an ongoing struggle.
And I think that returns back to that reinforcement of values you mentioned, and that celebration of the faculty members who are making that investment to expand the education beyond, let's say the learning outcomes. Yeah, excellent point. Go ahead, John Paul.
So this is a tough one, Holly, because this, I mean, you know, where do you even begin with this, right? So there's the question you posed, which is a fantastic question in itself. Then if we factor in remote teaching, how long is this going to continue? What sort of effect will that have and continue to have on the conversations we have and the way we assess in our universities? And I guess I would very much agree with Kelly that, you know, the best thing for us to do is to keep this conversation going and to think about who should be and who is involved in that conversation. And Sarah pointed out at the beginning of our panel discussion, the importance of including students in that and students as stakeholders. And, you know, I feel like I'm just repeating what's already been said, but I think it is so important, as Kelly has said and as Sarah has said, keep talking about it. Try and help students understand why it's important. Try and promote the values of integrity, talk about our norms, talk about our expectations, and to engage as many stakeholders as we possibly can.
Thank you. And absolutely repeat, please do. I think that reinforces the purpose of having a panel with a diverse spectrum of experiences and opinion. Definitely hearing that why factor theme again, that really to motivate compliance and motivate from both sides, faculty and the student. To your point, Kelly, you know, if you're going to be an engineer, let's look at this from the space of you need to be able to perform that skill, right? This is your ambition, your professional motivation. Sarah, did I see your hand as well?
Yeah, I wanted to add on to something, you know, Kelly was talking about, and what is normal behavior, as particularly in online environments, right? Like, I mean, dating back to the days of Napster, and so many of our students were born after the original Napster was in place. And ever since then, sharing has become such a normal part of online environments. And we share, we all share our status updates, our photos, our memes. And I always challenge my fellow academics and say, if you have ever shared an article, an academic article behind a paywall, or a book chapter that you weren't supposed to share, we also engage in those sharing behaviors. And so to broaden the conversation around what is normal online behavior and what is normal or expected academic behavior. And I think that there's a big tension between these right now. And we've effectively, in some ways for our students, demonized normal online behavior, which is sharing, gifting, sharing is fun, sharing is caring. This is also something we want to at least shift the conversation a little bit, because what we're telling our students now, sharing is also predatory. And that there are these commercial third parties out there who are looking to prey on you, and they want to tell you that sharing is caring, but really they're not there for you if this turns into a misconduct case. And to let our students know that there is an aspect of digital citizenship to this for them, and yes, they're responsible for their behaviors, but they also need to be aware of the companies that are out there. And I thought one of the things I would share with this group is, you've invited me today here as your provincial organization. We have our, Alberta organization, inspired by members of AICO when they came out and did a workshop at the Canadian Symposium in 2019. And inspired us to follow in your footsteps, basically. And I'd say one of the first resources that we've produced with our contract cheating working group is an analysis of the parallels between the contract cheating industry, contract cheating and some file sharing, not all of them, and organized crime. And things such as they may try and front their business with legitimate partnerships or legitimate services such as tutoring in order to have the back end of the dark side of their services, which may be illicit. That it's difficult to prosecute, that it's difficult for any individual, say, law enforcement officer for organized crime or instructor in education to take action against. People may not understand that once they're involved with this industry, that it can be very difficult to extricate themselves from it, so that they're involved then in the bullying and the harassment. And so we've sort of drawn up these parallels, and we're going to use this as a point of departure to advance conversations around legislation for contract cheating in our province. Again, we're years and years away from this, but wanted to start with this analysis. And I always tell my colleagues, if you think there's a bad guy in this conversation, it's not your students. It's the commercial third parties that are preying on them.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a very powerful perspective to add to this conversation. I think you're right in that we often focus on that, say, classroom piece, right, in relation to just assessments and credentials, but it is a much bigger conversation. I also just wanted to take a step back. You referenced digital citizenship, which I think is a very interesting point as well to add to this consideration of how can we educate our students to not just avoid these academic integrity violations, but to understand, again, if we're applying this to say their professional ambitions, is there an opportunity? My question to the panel would be, is this part of the conversation to be more proactive, to educate our students about not just, consequence and, the hand slap, the no, but that this is your responsibility in relation to digital citizenship as a whole? Do you think that that would be a valuable tool to embrace and introduce?
I'll jump in and say, even in our K-12 system now, conversations about how young people can and should protect themselves in online environments are conversations our teachers are starting to have. And I think we can extend and scaffold on those conversations in our post-secondary institutions and say, you also need to protect yourself from these third-party predators. We'll often think of other kinds of online predators for young people, but in post-secondary, these are academic predators. And to frame it that way for students as you need to protect yourself, and not everybody who's online is your friend.
It's a very powerful message. Please continue, Kelly.
Yeah, Sarah, I love that analogy. And I think part of the issue I see with that is, when I had middle school age children of my own and I tried to talk to them about the dangers of being online, they thought I was ridiculous. They didn't see it until they were presented with examples of some predatory behavior. And I feel the same in my conversations with college students when I try to express that message. They think that sometimes that I'm ridiculous. So I think the more we can show them examples of how, of just that, the predatory nature of some of these things and what the long-term consequences of them are. And I do also think there's, at least in New York State where I'm working, I feel like there's a huge disconnect between K-12 and university. When we get students, they're just, I'd like to work with, particular high schools to make this transition around our values about academic integrity and what the students need to be bringing with them as far as those values go, and start them earlier, because I really feel like that's a big issue for a lot of our students as they transition to university.
Excellent point. Thank you. And Jean Paul, please.
So I remember one of the first AICO meetings I attended. It was maybe 5 years ago or so. So I've been in my current role about 5 years. And at the meeting, there was, of course, discussion around contract cheating. And somebody pulled up a BBC News report, and students were being interviewed, and they had engaged in contract cheating. They had purchased papers and whatnot, and then they were being blackmailed by the service providers, for want of a better word. And I remember watching this at the time and thinking, my God, this is just shocking. But at the same time thinking, this is almost like the boogeyman. This is something that happens 1 in a million times, right? So, how much is this message going to resonate with students? Well, I can tell you, unfortunately, over the past year, we have seen this time and time and time again at our university. Well, we, as the Academic Integrity Office, we are the ones being contacted by the service provider saying, student X cheated, I wrote their paper for them. Here is everything you need, because this relationship has soured for whatever reason. And I want to say it's happened dozens of times, and we've done our best over the past year specifically, and we have done our best to try and tell students that this is very much a real consequence. It's not something that could happen to someone you may know. It's something that is happening to people you do know, and it is happening all the time. And it's not about scaring students, it's about being transparent with them and saying, these service providers, these companies, whatever you want to call them, they are not your friend. Please don't be fooled by them.
And I think applying the previous points just regarding the nature that students now work with their devices and they live and breathe these devices, that meaning that the file sharing, and that's sort of part of their everyday life, to really, it sounds to me like John Paul, you perhaps suggesting almost like a case study example to inform the more extreme situations that can arise and the consequences, of course, that would result from that.
Yes, and we've talked a little bit already about the way in which these companies and whatnot, they target students. I know even I get ads for them all the time. So I have an Instagram account, and maybe I've tagged university, or I've probably tagged academic integrity on my own account, and I get targeted. I get ads all the time. So if I'm getting targeted, what are students seeing day in, day out?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I get that as well. And thank you. Just to bring the audience's attention to the chat. Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. I saw that piece as well and was equally shocked. I do have a few questions now. I'd like to just pause and again, go back to Catherine and to our audience.
Yes, I think our audience is warming up a bit here. I have a few, so I'm going to start with one. The question is it an offense to share or to access information through these sites, or both?
Go ahead, Sarah. I think it's a great question.
It's a fabulous question. I think the answer is a definitive maybe, and a definitive either or in both. And is it an offense to share? And I think the answer might be yes, if what you're sharing is material you do not have the rights to share. If you're uploading your own class notes that you took yourself, and you as a student have the intellectual, that is your intellectual property, then maybe it's okay to share that. If you're uploading exam answers, that's not okay to share, in which case that would be seen as unauthorized collaboration and would be considered an academic misconduct offense. And then of course, is it a misconduct to download or then to download and use? So I'll go back to the drug analogy. Is it a crime for me to buy the drugs or then to buy them and use them? And these sort of get into the complicated areas of this messy discussion, right? And we often will bring this back to understanding a violation of academic integrity as something that gives one student an unfair advantage over another, and then thinking about what is that unfair advantage and whose advantages, who's being taken advantage of.
So it's really, Sarah, to summarize, it's defining what sharing means and who owns the rights to share that content.
It's part of the reason it's so messy, I think.
Mm-hmm. Definite gray zone. Yes, absolutely. And I believe we do have another question, Catherine.
We do. And Sarah, you engaged in analogy. I love analogies, and I think people also love stories. So a question for the panelists, if they could tell us about a situation that they faced with file sharing sites, and that they came to a resolution, but that resolution still eats away at them. I'm enjoying the pencil.
So, and I'll just jump in. Oh, go ahead, Sarah. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I don't deal with case management directly in my role, but I was going to tell a different story, and that was it's one about a media story that happened about a cheating case on our campus last year. And so, I try and keep my finger on the pulse of what stories are coming out in the news in Canada on academic misconduct. There was one last year. There was dozens of students involved in cheating regarding file sharing that came out in a particular course, made the media. It wasn't very pleasant. But then what we found out later was that the particular student who had gone to the media had several prior incidences of misconduct on their record, and thought that by going to the media, they could stir up enough attention that they would get a reduced sanction because they'd be able to blame the university for not outlining the expectations around the use of file sharing. And what ended up happening was other students who were involved in this came forward and said, we didn't know the student was going to go to the media. We want nothing to do with this media story. We want to just solve the case and move on. So it was an interesting case of a student trying to subvert the message, if you will, position the university as the bad guy in the story, and ended up, I would say, backfiring on the student. Although I can't disclose the results of the case, I can say that what the student had attempted to do did not result in the way that they had intended.
Okay, that's a very interesting transition into what should be an internal issue to becoming an external issue. I just want to take a step back. I did receive some messages in the chat as well before we go back to you, Catherine. One individual has also mentioned that they have a video for students that's called How to Protect Your Academic Integrity, which explores and discusses ways they can protect themselves. And it sounds very much in line with some of these much more extreme situations that perhaps we're not very aware of, that it can impact the daily lives of our students. Now, equally, there's a follow-up question just regarding, pardon me, I'm just going to read it out loud here. In what ways do your policies confirm what students should do, as opposed to what they should not do? And then, of course, by extension, in line with then outlining transparently the consequences of that. And perhaps I know that was a big one, so I'll summarize that again, is just basically informing students, where's the line? What does that boundary look like with regards to, say, supportive collaboration or transitioning into more problematic areas, but what formal policies do you have? And perhaps that's something that could be in the works. Maybe that's something that should be addressed. Go ahead, Kelly.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. And I'm thinking about our policy, which I pretty much have memorized. And it starts with a, platitude kind of a statement about the fundamental value of academic integrity in the academic enterprise and so on. But then it goes on to say, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. And it doesn't really say, do this instead. So I think the messaging last summer, my assistant director and I spent most of our summer revising our website and working really hard at making our website a place students could go for resources and information. And I think there we're framed much more positively in the things we have to say, but our actual policy is really framed in the, what not to do mindset.
And if I could just sort of summarize, Kelly, what I'm hearing is, again, it returns to that solution-oriented piece, doesn't it? Words like language like policies and frameworks have that negative connotation, right? A restrictive consequence. And really, I'm hearing this emotional piece that is to empower the students to conduct themselves in protection of themselves and in effort to support their academic success.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Excellent. Go ahead, John Paul, please.
Sure. Very similar to Kelly. So we have our policy. It's called Policy 60. It's got a real sexy name. And it is very much a rule book. It says, this is what's okay. This is what's not okay. And there's a lot of focus on what's not okay. And it says, these are the penalties and consequences. And then I talked about I mentioned that there are a lot of different procedures that are supposed to be followed when the policy is engaged. But what I would say with that is that our policy does not exist in isolation. Our policy exists as part of our university, and my office, the Academic Integrity Office, is responsible for administering that policy and for providing education to the entire university. And the way in which we sell it and the messaging through our website, through the way in which we communicate with pretty much everyone is, it's not about preventing misconduct, it is about promoting integrity. And we do that across the university in every possible way that we can think of. And I'm sure there are many that we haven't thought of. And we work with our partners right across the university. So I'll give you an example. So we've built into our policy that if a student goes through our process, whether they have been found to have engaged in misconduct or not, faculty can assign various educational components to the student, and the students are required to do these educational components. And we have a separate unit at the university called Student Life and Learning Support, who offer all these wonderful resources and workshops for any student who wants to, but these students were saying, look, you need to do this. And the whole point of that is, well, you folks get it, right? It's to help educate the students so they never have to have this conversation with the faculty member again. It's about helping them succeed. So, the main point I'm trying to make is that our policy doesn't exist in isolation. right? There are various units, various partners, including our faculty, including our various supports within and across the university that we work with to help promote integrity.
Thank you, John Paul. And you're right, that is a great sexy name. It sometimes just starts with a name to motivate, right? Over to you, Kelly, and then I do have a follow-up question I'll share from the chat.
Yeah, that's great, John Paul. I just wanted to follow up on that because the one thing about our policy that I didn't mention is that all undergraduate students who have a first-time non-egregious offense, to be very, straight about it, can do a remediation assignment with our office to clear their record. So they still get the penalty that the instructor applied in the class, but they don't have something on file with us to report out about. You can never re-clear your record if you have a second offense, and we built this in-house remediation program. It's, about a 5 or 6 hour online assignment. And they also have to have a meeting with me or the assistant director before and after to talk and reflect. So there is that educational component built in that is designed exactly as John Paul said. So they never have to have that conversation with an instructor again. The whole goal is to prevent a repeat offense. So I just wanted to put that out there.
That was excellent. And that's actually a perfect transition to the question and point that I have in the chat, which is, speaking to your individual schools, are there official ways that students can learn about the outcomes of an academic integrity violation, the cases that you've mentioned, in an anonymous way? The individual is sharing, stories can be powerful related to demonstrate circumstances like you've just described. Is that something that's introduced as well? Almost like a case study model of, cause and effect, if you will? Or would that be perhaps a privacy issue? Go ahead.
Yeah, we don't share actual cases, but in that remediation assignment that I was just talking about, we give them 10 scenarios taken from the headlines, ripped from things that have actually happened. And they have to analyze the scenario and identify the violation, the cause of the dishonesty, and then the effect it has on the student and the effect it has on others, which is my favorite part about the remediation assignment, because my experience with most students, when they do something dishonest, they're in that moment of just thinking about themselves and the stress they're trying to get through, and they're not seeing any domino effect of how this could affect their faculty member, their classmates, and so on. So no, we don't publicize our own cases, but we do try to use them in an educational way.
Go ahead, John Paul, and then Sarah.
Very similarly to Kelly. So, our policy says for action X, there is penalty Y. We have something called penalty guidelines. All of these are public. Now, whether students are going to take the time to look at them or not is another thing. We have frequently asked questions on our website. We try and make this information as accessible as we can. Very similar to Kelly again, we don't share specific cases for privacy for all sorts of reasons. Recently, however, our Faculty of Engineering at Ryerson, they've taken a bit of a different approach. They launched a social media campaign where they have been not sharing specific examples relative to individual cases, but giving more of a real life, this is what has been happening. So for example, in engineering, some of our students have been engaging with the website that people misname Chug at Ryerson. And as part of the social media campaign, engineering has been saying to students, if you post your test questions on a website looking for an answer during a test, there's a good chance you'll be suspended. That has been happening to students over the past year. So they're trying to make it they're trying to ground it in reality as opposed to having it this maybe possibly buried in some policy somewhere.
I can appreciate that. We did something similar where I believe I even included a Drake reference, right? You cannot call me on my cell phone. And it actually received some great responses on social media. So to your point, maybe it's not that text heavy consequential document. It's more just creating that relatable experience. Sarah, I saw your hand as well.
Yeah, I think this is an important conversation. And like Kelly and like John Paul, we don't take a fear-based approach to academic integrity promotion on our campus. And I think it's worthwhile recognizing that now today, UNESCO, for example, recognizes youth as being individuals up to age 30. So we're recognizing that an individual's identity and moral development continues through their late teens and early 20s. These are, for many of our students, not all of them, but many of our students, these are the years when we encounter them in the undergraduate and other programs on our campuses and at our institutions. And I don't know what you were like in your late teens and early 20s, but if an adult had told me, well, don't do this, well, I would run out and do exactly that thing, which led to great parties and great social experimentation. And through that developed, my own sense of what was right and wrong, of what I didn't want to do and who I wanted to be when I grew up. So one of the ways that we are aiming to position this is academic integrity is not about consequence avoidance or punishment avoidance. This is setting the foundation for ethical decision-making for life. And one of the participants today talked about the power of stories. So we have one of our associate deans that manages a program that's effectively a pre-med program. We don't call it that, but it's just that. And had a student who had found the file sharing materials on a particular site, sat the student down and said, look, you want to be a doctor? Do you really think that this is going to help you get into med school? And when the graduate admissions or the medical admissions committee looks at your application and then they check you out online, do you really think that they're going to want to admit you when they found out that you've been acting in this unethical way? We don't want physicians like that in our program. And the students' color drained from their face because they realized the long-term implications. Now, it wasn't a broad-based fear educational program. It was a one-on-one targeted mentoring conversation with students to say, look, this is about you, your reputation, and your future. Protect it and act accordingly.
Sarah, a rebellious teenager? Oh, what? What? That's a spectacular example. Thank you. Now, I am mindful of time, so we have one final question that I'd like to pose to the panel. I'll pass it over to Catherine before we wrap things up today, but this has been spectacular. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. So this last question is, for the panel, how well do you know the motivations of students when they use these sites? And further to that, do you have any data on why they're using them?
Okay, and I know that we're having a bit of a challenge here with your microphone, so I'll just repeat that question. How do you dissect or understand the motivation of a student? Is there any data that you can share that speaks to the motivation of infractions that a student may conduct?
I don't really have data except to say that, when we have those remediation meetings with students, and most students avail themselves of our remediation, we ask them probing questions. What made you get on the website? What made you do that? And, their answers are commonly the things we know. I ran out of time. I panicked. I was stressed. If I failed, I was going to lose my financial aid. If they have other consequences. So, usually, again, they're just thinking about themselves. They're just thinking about that moment, and they're not able to step back and extrapolate, a larger perspective of what else this means. That's been my experience.
Go ahead, John Paul.
Kelly, you and I have such similar experiences. It's funny. Like quite a few of you, I would imagine, last April and May in 2020, we saw a huge spike at the university of reported cases coming into us. And we had so many conversations with students where students said, you know what, I have never done this before. I will never do this again. With everything going on in my life and the world, I made a poor decision in the moment. And I believe those students, I really do. Excuse me. And I think it's important to remember that now more than ever, that there is so much stress. And, people talk about all of us being in this together. And I don't know that I necessarily buy that, because our students have such disparate experiences. Some of them are in homes where they're sharing a bedroom with siblings. Some of them, there's all those various examples. I don't need to name them for you, but I think it's just important to keep in mind that now more than ever, our students are facing different pressures. And to keep that in mind when we are designing our assessments, when we're considering things like extension requests, all those types of things.
I think that's a wonderful note to conclude our session today on. It reminds me of a message I received from my chair at the end of last term, referring to empathetic education and really humanizing that experience, especially given the extreme situation. So thank you for sharing that. And if I could then return to my previous message, which is I stand firm. This was an amazing panel of experts. You deserve that title and language. Thank you so much for your time and investment today. Thank you to the audience for your contributions.